History is not written in ink, but in blood. The language of power in the darkest ages was not words or letters, but the crunch of bones and the smell of burning flesh. It was a brutal grammar, carved into the bodies of those who dared to defy it. 3 deaths, separated by centuries and geography, define the syntax of this language. The drawing of William Wallace in 1305 was a declaration of absolute domination. The burning of Joan of Arc in 1431 was a desperate attempt to extinguish an idea with fire. And the beheading of Conradin in 1268 was the death of a legacy, the bloody end of a dynasty. These were not executions. They were elaborate spectacles, where the scaffolding was the stage, and a message was delivered with the blows of the executioner's knife. William Wallace. The body is tortured, the soul is immortal. In the late 13th century, Scotland was not a nation, but a prize. In a succession crisis known as the Great Cause, King Edward I of England, nicknamed the Hammer of the Scots, had imposed his suzerainty, reducing the kingdom to a vassal province. Amidst that humiliation, a spark flew from the petty nobility. William Wallace was neither a prince nor an earl. He embodied the simmering rage of an oppressed people. The murder of his wife, Marion Braidfield, by the English Sheriff of Lanark was more than a personal tragedy. It was the trigger for a storm. Wallace responded not with a rallying cry, but with steel. The sheriff's head rolling across the floor was the first declaration of war. His rallying cry was not knights in shining armor, but peasants, blacksmiths, men who had turned their farm tools into deadly weapons. The unlikely victory at Stirling Bridge was no fluke. It was military genius. Wallace and Andrew Moray used the terrain itself as a weapon, trapping the English heavy cavalry, the pride of Edward's army, in a marshy landscape, turning them into helpless targets. Here, Wallace invented the schiltron, a mobile hedgehog of foot soldiers, a wall of steel and courage that could withstand the strongest cavalry charges. The victory transformed Wallace from a rebel into the protector of Scotland. He was more than a warrior. He was also a diplomat, sending missions to France and Rome to seek recognition and support for Scottish independence, demonstrating his political vision far beyond the battlefield. But his star was extinguished at Falkirk, where English longbows did what cavalry could not. Betrayal by a Scottish noble, John de Menteith, ended his 7 years of hiding. The trial at Westminster Hall was a staged show designed to legalize murder. The charge was high treason. Legally, however, it was a false charge. Wallace had never sworn allegiance to Edward, and Scotland was, at least in theory, a separate kingdom. His immortal reply, "I cannot betray Edward because I have never been his subject," exposed the entire sham of the trial. He was not on trial for a crime. He was on trial for his very existence. Wallace's execution was designed to be a lesson in the anatomy of horror. Dragged through the streets of London, hanged until nearly dead, disemboweled while still conscious, castrated, and finally granted the freedom of the guillotine. But Edward made a fatal mistake. By distributing Wallace's body parts, his head on London Bridge, his limbs in Newcastle, Berwick, Stirling, and Perth, he inadvertently turned them into sacred relics. Instead of sowing fear, he sowed the seeds of martyrdom. Each piece of Wallace's rotting flesh became an altar to Scottish patriotism. His death did not extinguish the resistance. It gave it an immortal soul, one that Robert the Bruce would later inherit to win freedom at Bannockburn. Jeanne d'Arc, the fire that purifies ideas. If Wallace was the embodiment of physical resistance, Joan of Arc was the embodiment of divine rebellion. In the early 15th century, France was on its deathbed, ravaged by the 100 Years' War and internal strife. With a future king, Charles VII, known for his vacillation and indecision, France seemed ready to collapse. Then an illiterate peasant girl from Domremy appeared, claiming to receive orders from God. Her visions were not vague whispers. They were clear military and political directives. Her very existence was a challenge to every medieval power structure: a woman commanding men, a peasant advising royalty, a mortal conversing directly with the heavens. Her intervention at Orleans was not a miracle in the supernatural sense, but a psychological one. She inspired an army that had lost all hope. Contemporary descriptions of her were not of an ethereal beauty, but of a strong, sturdy, dark-haired girl, a true soldier. Her wounding and return to battle made her a living symbol of divine will. Charles VII's coronation at Reims with her by his side was the culmination of her mission, an affirmation that God was on France's side. Her capture by the Burgundians and her sale to the English for 10,000 gold crowns transformed her from a prisoner of war into a political commodity. The English knew they could not simply kill her. They had to destroy the ideas she represented. The trial at Rouen, orchestrated by Bishop Pierre Cauchon and backed by the University of Paris, then the theological center of Europe, was an attack on the very source of her power. At the heart of the trial was a sophisticated theological argument. Jean had committed the ultimate sin. She had appealed directly to the church triumphant, God and the saints in heaven, bypassing the judgment of the church militant, the church on earth. In doing so, she had undermined the entire power structure of the church. The accusation of cross-dressing was not just about the dress. It was a symbol of her subversion of the social and divine order. Her moment of weakness and signing the renunciation document showed that she was just a human being. But her defiance just 3 days later, when she dressed again in men's clothes and retracted her confession, transformed her from a victim into a conscious martyr. She had chosen her fate, Conradin, beheading a dynasty. If the deaths of Wallace and Jean were confrontations between nation and empire, between personal faith and institution, then Conradin's death was a clash between two visions of the world. On one side stood the Hohenstaufen, the dynasty of holy Roman emperors who believed in a universal, secular empire. On the other stood the Pope, who claimed supremacy over kings, allied with an emerging power. The monarchical states, represented by Charles of Anjou, a ruthless and ambitious French prince. Conradin, 16, was the last hope of the Hohenstaufen legacy. He was the grandson of Frederick II, the wonder of the world, an emperor who had defied the popes for decades. Conradin's invasion of Italy was not an act of aggression, but an attempt to reclaim his inheritance in the century-old conflict between the Ghibellines, supporting the emperor, and the Guelphs, supporting the pope. The Battle of Tagliacozzo was a tragic lesson in the naivety of youth versus the cunning of experience. Conradin's men won the initial engagement, but they fell into Charles's classic trap, a feigned retreat followed by a devastating counterattack from the reserves. The ensuing betrayal left Conradin in the hands of his enemies. His trial in Naples set a terrifying precedent. He was not tried as a defeated opponent in a feudal war. He was tried as a criminal against the state, a challenger to the order established by God and the Pope. Pope Clement IV himself is said to have said the cruel words, "Conradin's life is Charles's death, and Conradin's death is Charles's life," suggesting that this was a duel to the death. The execution of an anointed king by public legal process was unthinkable, a violation of every rule of the chivalric world. On the scaffold, Conradin performed one of the most dramatic gestures of the Middle Ages. He removed his glove, a symbol of honor and trust, and threw it into the crowd, a muted call for vengeance and the continuation of his legacy. Legend has it that a knight picked it up and carried it to Aragon, sparking the subsequent uprising. His death achieved Charles's short-term goal. It severed the Hohenstaufen line, but it also created a political earthquake. Kings across Europe were horrified by the precedent. In Germany, his death ushered in the Great Interregnum, which weakened imperial power for generations. In Sicily, Charles's brutal rule led to the Sicilian Vespers Massacre of 1282, a bloody uprising that drove the French from the island. By executing a young man, Charles and the Pope had won a battle, but had sown the seeds of future strategic defeats. Legacy in blood and memory. Wallace, Jean, and Conradin. A patriot, a saint, a king. All three were crushed by state power, their bodies destroyed in public rituals designed to terrorize and subdue. But the powerful always underestimate a fundamental force: human memory. They may control the stage, but they cannot control the story that follows. The brutality of the punishment, rather than asserting power, highlights injustice. It turns the victim into a hero, the condemned into a martyr. Wallace's dismembered body united Scotland. Joan's ashes fanned the flames of French nationalism. Conradin's blood watered the roots of hatred against tyranny. Ultimately, these displays of power show their own limits. You can kill a man, but you cannot kill a symbol. You can burn a woman, but you cannot burn a belief. You can behead a king, but you cannot sever a legacy. On these stages of blood, those in power attempted to write the final chapter, but it was the condemned, in the defiant silence of death, who had the last word.